Hello everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon. You can see myself, Marcus Smith and Kirsten Arnold. We prepared this as a webinar session which we ran a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of interest in the topic and in the session, so we decided to offer it again for the Aggregators Fair today. And it's recorded as a webinar, so this avoids any sound issues. But Tamara, could you play the recording for us, please? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat and for joining us this afternoon. If I could ask Kirsten to change the first slide. So welcome everyone. I'm speaking on behalf of the Karari Association, which aims to advance professional practice and foster appreciation of the digital archaeological heritage. This webinar is the first in a series that we're planning under the hashtag Connecting Archaeology. And today we're aiming to explore the ways that cultural institutions can use controlled vocabularies and linked data, with a special focus on improving discoverability of content in Europeana. There's just a few housekeeping notes. So we're recording this webinar and it will be published and available later on. We've muted all of your lines, but you'll see that there is a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you want to ask us, please write them into the Q&A. We'll come back to them at the end of the webinar. There'll be a session right at the end. And you can use the Zoom chats for general thoughts, comments, or to share links with us. So the programme, we have 3 speakers, each giving short presentations, and there'll be time at the end for questions and discussion. The first speaker today is Kirsten Arnold from Archives Portal Europe Foundation, and her presentation is on Speaking One Language, How Vocabularies Can Help Organise Information. This will be followed by Marcus Smith of the Swedish National Heritage Board, who will talk about linked data vocabularies for heritage data, and I'll finish up by talking about how you can exploit vocabularies and linked data. So Kirsten, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Kate, and thank you for inviting me to talk in this first iteration of your webinar. As Kate mentioned, my title is Speaking One Language, How Vocabularies Can Help Organize Information. And I thought a good picture to illustrate that would be the Tower of Babel and the question of how do we actually find our ways in today's information society? And how can we structure the confusio linguarum that we are presented with? And one way to do this is via vocabularies. And what I want to start with is a very general, high-level definition of vocabularies and similar terms that you might have heard already in your day-to-day work. Starting with vocabularies, you could define them as a list of standardized terms or codes. Vocabularies usually are controlled, and that can be on a local level within your own institution. It can be on national levels. It can be on international levels. Control in this context means that there is a process in place to agree on the initial list of terms and codes that you want to use, and that there is a process in place to agree on any changes and additions to that list. The vocabulary usually is authorized, so you know which organization is behind the vocabulary, and it's made available for use either internally, if it's just an institutional vocabulary, or on other levels. As an example to illustrate what a vocabulary could be, I'm using this color circle from Ignaz Schiffermüller from the late 18th century. And just going around this circle clockwise, you could just list the colors that he mentioned in here. And you can see that this list doesn't necessarily have to be alphabetical. So Often vocabularies will be alphabetical just to give some orientation, but it's not necessarily a requirement. If you wanted to extend that a little bit, you would be moving from a vocabulary to a taxonomy. Taxonomies help to classify the terms within a controlled vocabulary. So it often starts organizing these terms hierarchically and establishing relationships that are broader or narrower terms, so essentially establishing parent-child relationships between the different terms in your vocabulary. It might also be that your taxonomy is polyhierarchical. That means one term can appear in multiple broader terms. Looking again at the example of the color circle, this might change our list a little bit, adding some hierarchy in there and organizing all the blues, all the greens, all the reds, all the yellows underneath one main node. If you wanted to extend that even further, you could think about Thesauri. So Thesauri add cross-references to the hierarchical relationships that you already have in a taxonomy. So something that is saying, see also. But Thesauri might also include synonyms, antonyms, and variant relationships. It may include explanations of the terms. So it's not only the terms, but also some contextual descriptive note type of information that is available to you. And that makes the use of these terms in indexing easier. And a thesauri might also include information about a term's history. So I mentioned the changes and the process of creating changes in the vocabulary at the beginning. And so it might be that a term was established in one way at the beginning, but has moved towards a slightly different way of being represented at the current stage. Looking again at one example from our color circle, this could be that we look specifically at the color crimson, and we could say that this is a narrow term to red, that it is related to purple, that it is used for slightly bluish red colors that are between red and rose, and that there is a previous form called crimacine. Further extending on thesauri, you would get to ontologies. Ontologies usually add further, more specific relation options. So instead of saying something is related to something else, you could say this person is the father of this person. Ontologies also often include relationships between different types of entities. So you could say there is is located at relationship between an organization and a place, or an is maintained by relationship between an object and an organization. And often, but not always, ontologies are domain specific, which also speaks to the more specific possibilities that you have with relationships in an ontology. And just one last time, looking at our color circle example, you could extend what we had initially in the thesaurus for crimson to saying this is derived from purple, this is derived from blue. You could add, is similar to carmine. You could go into other areas and could say this is used for textiles or used by dyers in their occupation. And you can extend that in more specific ways. Why would we need vocabularies or other types of them to find our ways in the Confusio Linguarum? And there are different aspects that we might want to think about. One thing that might be obvious specifically when you talk about an international aggregation system is languages, writing systems, and spellings. So you could have the name of Tizian in all different kinds of languages and having one vocabulary entry for him to bind all of these together will make it easier to move from one language to the other. You could also think of this in terms of localization. So this is an example for the multiple terms that exist in German for bread rolls. And just from my own experience, you should never try to buy a Brötchen at a bakery in Bavaria because you just won't get it. So here again, it's good to have some crosswalks essentially between these different terms. There also, of course, in our context, is the relationship between historical and contemporary terms that vocabularies will make you help you establish. So coming from Lutetia to Paris. This might also be useful for culturally inappropriate terms, making connections between some terms that have been used at a specific time just because they were part of the language at that point of time, but may have been replaced by other more appropriate terms in nowadays languages. And you will also find domain and content specific terms where it's useful to have some kind of more day-to-day language terms that specifically users can pick up on in order to find their way through. And this is just an example from the archives of the Federal Commissioner for the Records of the State Security Service of the former GDR, and all the different terms that they have been using to, essentially describe records that are related to their, let's say, public spies that they used to spy on their people. And just as a last point, leading over to the following two presentations that go more into detail on this. So how do vocabularies help us make sense in the confuso linguarum, which are the examples where we can use vocabularies? And one is retrieval. So you can use a vocabulary term as your node to start research, again, across different languages, ideally. You can use them for disambiguation to define which Tizian you are talking about in a descriptive text. And you can use them to build relations between different entities and to extend your knowledge graph as far as you would like to. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Marcus, who will be talking about linked open data and how that connects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to try to share my screen now. I guess everyone can see that. Good. Okay. Hi, I'm Marcus Smith. I'm a development officer at the Swedish National Heritage Board. I work with the linked open data aggregator, Swedish Open Cultural Heritage. And following on from Kirsten, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about linked data vocabularies specifically for heritage data. So the first thing to point out is probably that whatever the domain you're particularly working in, the chances are good that there are already existing vocabularies that are published as linked data that you can be using. And if those vocabularies do exist, then I would encourage you to start using them, mapping your data to them or mapping your internal vocabularies to them. The whole point of having shared vocabularies is that multiple organizations use the same terminology and can relate to the same concepts. We're going to end actually by going over a few of the more prominent existing vocabularies that you can use within heritage data. But let's, for the time being, pretend that your particular domain is not already covered and there is no vocabulary for you. In that case, you can publish your own, either creating it from scratch, or if you have an internal vocabulary that you're already using within your organization or data set, you can adapt that and publish it as linked data. So how would you go about doing that? The first thing to do is to make sure that you switch from just a list of terms to a list of IDs. So separating unique identifiers from the terms themselves. This is just generally good data practice in general, but it allows you to then associate multiple values with for each term that you have. So for example, you might want to have, as Kirsten mentioned, multiple languages, multiple writing systems. You might want to have preferred and alternate forms for those terms. You might want to add scope notes. You might have other attributes like date created that you want to add, and you might want to relate it to other terms, broader and narrower hierarchies, or identities across different vocabularies. So if you do that, then suddenly you have a more structured vocabulary. It's not just a data dictionary, it's not just a list of terms, but you have a bit of structure to it. The second thing to do if you're going to publish as linked data is to not just use any old identifier, but to make those IDs specifically IRIs. So not just an ID, but specifically an ID that takes the form of a web address that you can look up and get data back from. permanent, dereferenceable, machine-readable IDs. And this means that then you can start using these terms and IDs within your own linked data as you publish them. It also means that other people can start using them when they describe their data as linked data. They can link to your terms and reuse them. If you're just starting out, a good place to start is just to have a simple list of terms with IRIs as RDF schema with basic attributes. But if you're going to be doing things properly, and we like to do things properly, then use the Simple Knowledge Organization System, SKOS. This is an RDF application for linked data, an ontology that is all about how to describe and structure linked data vocabularies. So it relates terms to one another within a hierarchy or a polyhierarchy. You can have links to similar or equivalent terms both within the vocabulary, but also out to other vocabularies that maybe cover sort of the same area, but maybe the terms aren't identical. It's useful then to be able to link them together. And apart from anything else, if you're not familiar with linked data and RDF as a concept, SKOS is a really great place to start because it's quite a compact ontology. It's quite intuitive to understand. There's a limited number of predicates that are in there, and it's a good place to start if you're working with linked data in practice for the first time. It's quite easy to get started with. So then I thought if you're going to adapt your existing vocabulary or start from scratch, you need to have some tools to work from. So I'm just going to list a few. There are many others, but these are some useful ones, some good places to start. The Ariadne International Project has a bunch of resources that are quite useful for creating or publishing vocabularies, not least of which is the vocabulary tool from the German Archaeological Institute, which also is linked against existing SKOS terms with external vocabularies. SKOSify and SpreadSKOS, these are both applications for taking existing tabular data, tabular vocabularies, and in an easy way, turning those into SKOS vocabularies that you can then publish as linked data. Stellar, Star, Seneschal, and Stiletto, these are all outputs from the Hypermedia Research Centre at the University of South Wales. They're all heritage oriented. They're not just for vocabularies, but they are also all designed around the idea of taking existing, usually tabular or relational data, and transforming it in such a way that it can then be published as linked data, and particularly as SKOS. And then finally, Ascosi, this is a sort of a group whose entire existence is predicated on enabling and providing tools for publishing and maintaining linked open data SKOS vocabularies. So I said at the beginning that your domain is probably already covered by existing SKOS vocabularies for heritage data. I'm going to go through a few of those now. There are a lot of existing vocabularies, and I'm not going to go over all of them. This is going to be an incomplete list. If I miss out your favorite heritage data vocabulary, then by all means, link it in the chat, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate that. Starting from the most general, probably the two most widely used within heritage data and within digital humanities in general are Library of Congress subject headings. These are subject keywords, basically. And the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, which covers periods, styles, object types, all kinds of art history and architectural terms. And then Period O, which is sort of an international list of periods and chronologies that are geographically bound, such that you can be, so that if you're talking about, for example, the Bronze Age, which Bronze Age are you talking about? Are you talking about Bronze Age in China, Bronze Age in South Sweden, Bronze Age where and when? You can define different chronologies and periods and then relate them to one another, which means that you can use your own chronology that's relevant for the data that you're talking about, and it will still be interoperable with other chronologies. Then we've got heritage data. This is a really great resource from the three big heritage agencies in the UK, CADU, Historic Scotland and Historic England, with monuments types, thesauri, chronologies, artifact types, archaeological techniques, recovery techniques, all that kind of stuff. Really useful. Creative Commons and rightstatements.org, when you're publishing your linked data, of course, you'll be publishing it with particular rights statements and licenses, and you should be using something like Creative Commons or rightstatements.org or similar well-known licenses to describe the rights statements that your data has. And then just finally, quickly, we have VIAF, the Virtual Internet Authority file. This is really useful for authority data on authors and bibliographic data. Then we've got Finto, which is the Finnish National Vocabulary and Ontology Service. Other national ontology and vocabulary services are available, but Finto is a particularly good example because it's well maintained and it has national backing. So, and also it's multilingual, English, Finnish, and Swedish. And then finally, Wikidata. Wikidata is a fantastic resource. You can upload your own vocabularies there as Wikidata entries. You can map your vocabularies to existing Wikidata concepts. It's also great as a node for relating your vocabularies to others. So if you can map your vocabulary to Wikidata concepts, the chances are that the Wikidata concept will in turn have outgoing links to related concepts in other vocabularies. So it's a great way to find relationships to other vocabularies. And Europeana actually has a really good guide for relating your vocabularies to Wikidata and getting those concepts up there. So in conclusion, if there are existing LOD vocabularies for your domain, which chances are there are, you should use them. If there aren't, then you should publish your existing vocabularies as linked data or create some from scratch. Use resolvable web addresses, IRIs, as your identifiers in your vocabularies, and if you can, use structured SCOS vocabularies when you're publishing. And with that, I shall hand over to Kate.
Okay, I'm hoping that you all see the slide view rather than the presenter view. I'm going to talk about some of the ways that you can actually make use of the vocabularies and that Marcus and Kirsten have been talking about. And speaking as from the background of Karari, we've been working with heritage organisations across Europe since 2010, specifically in the context of Europeana, helping them to share their data sets with Europeana. Over that time, we've been receiving data sets for aggregation. They're mainly exported from databases. Some are being captured using simple spreadsheets or XML editors. And what we've wanted to do over this time is to look at the way we can develop tools to help make it easier for people to share their data and to improve the qualities, particularly with regard to vocabularies and multilinguality. I'm going to speak about two recent projects which have allowed us to do some work in this area. The first one is the Share3D project, which included the development of a metadata capture dashboard, and the second, Europeana Archaeology, where we looked at vocabulary services for mapping and enrichment of data sets. So really what we want to do is to make it as easy as possible for people to use vocabularies and linked data. I'm going to talk about the Share3D dashboard, and it does have a focus on 3D models, but the challenge is the same with all content, because when it comes to capturing data or to cataloguing content, everyone wants it to be as easy as possible. And having a printed vocabulary in a word list is a great starting point, but when you come to enter data into a system, you really want the system to help you with the process. So something like this dashboard, which is an online cloud-based tool, begins to allow you to actually integrate. In this case, you can see I'm selecting terms from the AAT subject, the Getty's AAT vocabulary, and the form just simply allows you to type in the concept that you're looking for. It will offer you a list of possible terms, and you can pick the ones that you want and enter it into the database. But normally what happens with a data entry system is that you feel that a concept is missing. It's not available on the list. You want to type something more specific about the object that you're cataloguing. In this case, I want to indicate that it's a brass tin and it's associated with the Princess Mary. So the system that we designed allows both options of choosing a term from a list, but also making a free text entry. If I go on to the next example, within the system, what we've done is created our own vocabulary, in effect. It's a simple period list. But what we wanted to do was to allow people to make a categorization of the content that they were entering. And so we created a vocabulary list, which is our terms are mapped to AAT terms and also to Wikidata, and they're linked to a start and to an end date. So when I look at the record that's been created in the system, what you're looking at now is an example of a metadata record in Europeana's EDM format. You can see that there is the reference to the get is AAD, the UID of the term under DC subject, and you can see that I've also created a time span. The start date and an end date reference is to, again, to the AAT and to Wikidata. So I've got a relatively simple system for capturing metadata. But actually, I've already said that most of the data sets that we receive in Corari have been created on people's own systems. They normally include terms from local word lists in the national language, and we want to help people to exploit linked data to be able to begin to add multilingualism, to add alternate concept labels to those terms in other languages. So one of the ways of doing that is making a mapping of a vocabulary to a linked data source. And in this case, you can see an example of a Czech vocabulary, which has been mapped to AAT concept labels with the UID for that concept identified. You can do that using a simple spreadsheet. But if you have a longer vocabulary, it does take time to complete because it's a thoughtful process. You have to work your way through it. So we wanted to see if there was a way of making it easier for people both to create their mappings, but also to exploit those mappings on their data sets as quickly as possible. So what we did in Europeana Archaeology was, instead of focusing on mapping the entire vocabulary, we looked at ways of extracting keywords from the data sets that were actually provided to us. So here you'll see the demo is taking a small data set, which is in EDM format, and uploading it to the system. Now, this is a very small data set, so the upload's pretty quick, but it extracts all of the keywords in the terms. It gives you an indication of how many times that keyword's been used in the data set. And then you can begin to create a mapping. And again, we've linked it to the AAT subject vocabulary so that you can choose the term that you want to map and create your mapping. Now, this is a process that you can do over time. So if you have a large data set and you want to make a start on using mappings to AAT, you can map the most commonly used terms and then use that in order to make an enrichment of your data set and come back later on and build up your mapping to add more and more terms as you go. But each time, once you've created a mapping in the system, you can use it immediately to make an enrichment of the data set that you provided. It's a very, very simple process. Once the enrichment's been created,
you can download the enriched data set, and you can see in this case, it is again an EDM record where the original keywords are retained, but what we've done is add UIDs to keywords from the Getty's vocabulary, and also to create time spans, again, which are referenced to the Getty's AAT and to Wikidata. Having made this mapping and created these relationships, we can begin to access the Getty's linked data source, which gives us access to additional information. So now we can add preferred concept labels in multiple languages, alternate concept labels in multiple languages, and we've got all of the relationships within the thesaurus to the broader and narrower concepts. What this looks like in terms of Europeana is that it allows Europeana to dereference the AT URLs and add the concept labels in different languages. On this slide, you can see two examples. One with the labels displayed in Spanish and English, and the other with the labels in Dutch and English. Now we're beginning to improve the multilinguality and to allow these concepts to be used in multilingual searches. In terms of what you see in Europeana, it depends on the language of the browser that you're looking in. In this case, my browser is set in English. But what I get is, in addition to the labels or the concepts that I added in my data, is I can begin to use them to browse within Europeana. There's an element of randomness and serendipity in this, so we can see that we have an ornament, which has a castle form, some illustrations, and we have a set of aerial photographs. But it allows people to explore the content that's there in ways that they wouldn't have been able to do previously, and they can explore within their own language much better than previously if the language stayed simply as the national language. So there's more flexibility. So in conclusion, the benefits of using vocabularies and linked data include easing data entry. They definitely improve the consistency of the data that's created. Once you've started to use them, you improve the discovery of your content by helping users to find connected items using their own language. And finally, I just wanted to say that the tools that I've demonstrated are both freely available online. So if you'd like to know more, please contact me about them. And now I'd like to invite you to ask questions.
Great. So the floor is open. Does anyone have any questions for myself, Marcus, or Kirsten? I can see Marie-Veronique Leroy is highlighted in yellow in the middle of my screen. So I'm thinking that maybe means she's thinking about asking a question.
Actually, no question, but thank you very much for the very nice presentation.
Thank you. Marie-Veronique, if there's a vocabulary in French, would you share the link in the chat for us?
Yes, I think I can do that. And our main difficulty, as I have the floor, is that one thing that we have trouble to do is to get people to work together in order to agree on the vocabularies, because each service or department is willing to promote its own vocabulary, so it's difficult to get to a shared knowledge graph. Is there some issues that you are facing with the several partners that you have, you, Kirsten, or even Marcus?
I think in our context, so for Arca Support Europe, it certainly is an issue because there are just so many different approaches to vocabularies, and some of the countries that are participating already have established ones and others don't. And to kind of balance those two approaches is one of the tricky things that we are faced with in our context.
A couple of the problems that we face with the SOC aggregator is it's either that museums have their own particular way of describing artifacts or archaeological contexts or whatever it is that they have in their databases, which don't really map to existing vocabularies very easily. So they would either have to go through a lot of work to map their internal vocabulary to something that already exists, or to publish their own vocabulary as linked data. Either that, or they actually have vocabularies internally that map very easily to existing vocabularies as linked data, but getting them to do that and to see the value of providing data in that way is sometimes a bit of a challenge because their systems are not set up to do it.
My experience is when I've been involved in vocabulary and terminology working groups is you can spend hours and hours discussing a single term and whether it should be added to a vocabulary list or not. So my experience with Karari over the last 10 years is that we're seeing databases from loads of different organizations. We don't really have any influence or control over which vocabularies they choose to use. They're embedded into their systems. So what I was keen to do in Europeana was to actually work with what we had rather than trying to take a sort of trying to introduce a common vocabulary standard and then somehow expecting it to be implemented by lots of different organizations across Europe, which is why we took the approach in the vocabulary tool of extracting the terms that, or the concepts that exist, and then encouraging people to map as many as they could in the time that they had available so that we could begin to make improvements to the data that was provided into Europeana.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I just wanted to say it's very interesting what Kate has shown, because indeed it's very important to use international standards like the AAT, for example. But when there's one language that is missing, then it becomes a bit specifically for countries who have more than one language in their database. For example, in Belgium, you need French and you need Dutch and English. And when these languages, the AAT, for example, there's only like a limited amount of French terms and it becomes difficult to use. So it's very interesting to see that you can map those with the tool that you showed. So yeah, I just wanted to say that it's very interesting to see. And that for multilingual organizations, it's always yeah, a bit difficult to use, for example, the AAT when the language is not used. But there are some yeah, projects to translate into French and stuff. So it's something that is always evolving. So I think in the future it will be better.
Thanks very much, Eva. I can see Marcus has his hand up, and also there's a question for Marcus from Spiros in the chat about
that is in fact the question that I wanted to address.
Yes.
So Spiros has asked a question in the chat. Let's say I get some linked data using Sparkle. How can I deduce knowledge from that data and visualize connected items? So we'll take the first half first. How can you deduce knowledge from linked data? That's actually not directly related to vocabularies, but rather is more related to the ontologies that are used to describe the data. So with vocabularies and schemas, you're describing what things we can talk about and what terms we can use to talk about them. Whereas with the ontology, you're more describing what inferences you can draw, what knowledge you can gain from the statements that are made about these items. So you need to look at the ontology and what that describes about how things relate to each other and what you can deduce from those relationships, the implicit relationships that are there. There are tools called reasoners that will let you do that in a sort of an automated way. And often Sparkle endpoints will employ reasoners to produce implicit relations that are there according to the ontology, but aren't necessarily in the data itself. And then how to visualize connected items. There are a bunch of tools that you can use. I think Gephi is one that's quite good for visualizing graph data in that way. But I have to confess that visualizing linked data in that way is not something that I'm particularly familiar with. So maybe somebody else has better suggestions than Gephi.
Fiona's making some suggestions. She's written in the chat that there's further information on our Europeana Sparkle API, which could help, and posted the link to this and a link to a cool project using Sparkle and linked data. Thanks, Fiona.
Kate?
Yeah, Sergio?
Sorry, I was also working something in the same time and I missed the exact question. Could you repeat it? I might have some input.
Question in the chat is, let's say I get some linked data using Sparkle.
Okay.
How can I deduce knowledge from that data and visualize connected items?
I'm not sure what that means. How can I deduce knowledge? So if we are extracting, if we are getting data through a Sparkle endpoint, that means that an ontology is used and the representation is standardized, so that what we get from Sparkle is knowledge. The question is, yeah, how do you want to represent in a front-end application that is something different? But from the experience, yeah, okay, depends what you are doing, but the Sparkle endpoints are, let's say, for professional users, they are typically not performant enough to have for scalable applications for end users. They are still too slow for that. The connected items, then so that everything in what we get from Sparkle has an ontology, a schema. The connected items will have their classes, and you can follow the links to retrieve the data of the connected things. Probably some interesting question would be if you want to extract a simple graph from the connected items, which would be also possible, and to show the connections as a graph in a visual representation. That is something interesting. It's not very hard, also not very easy to use, but the question is always with this linked data, what do you want exactly to get out of it? Because everything is linked and you can click through it through the same repository, but that's not the purpose. Yeah, the main question is, which is the scenario, what you really want to offer to the end user. That's the driving question in the linked data world, my opinion.
Okay, thanks very much, Sergio. I think I'm more at the simple practical implementation end of this conversation. So I'm always very interested in systems and forms and using things in searches and retrieval. So definitely on the user side of this conversation. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask us now? If there are no further questions, I think we've arrived at the end of our time slot. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.